You're live.
Welcome to House Education. It's Friday, May 15th at approximately 10:30 in the morning. We'll be starting this morning looking at H 955, an act relating to next steps in transforming Vermont's education system. A walkthrough of the Senate changes with Ledge Council. Who's calling to first?
James, obviously legislative council. I think we walked through all of my sections yesterday. So you have John. But I also didn't know if you wanted to do questions.
Any questions on what we walked through yesterday?
No. Yes, it's me. Morning.
Morning.
And Frank Ray with the Office of Legislative Counsel, and it is Friday, May 15th. And we're here. Okay, I'm going to share something that presumably is going to look a lot like what Beth previously shared with you. It's a side-by-side, as passed by House Senate Finance. I'm happy to go through these for any section in which there's no difference. I'm not going to talk about it unless you want me to. Since you guys have already seen the underlying material. When I went through this in Senate Appropriations, because they weren't familiar with, all of the sections as passed by the House, I tried to speak to what Section 65, for instance, is about, but I don't think I need to do that for you guys. So Section 66 is the first area where we see a change between the House position and Senate Finance. This is a section that deals with staffing the school construction division. The basic way to describe this is to say that the Senate Finance Committee tried to address both short-term and long-term funding. So in the House proposal for fully staffing the school construction division, there was no appropriation. There was just a request that AOE come back with an FY28 budget to fully staff the school construction division. The Senate, there's 1.5 million or 1.425 million in the budget available for purposes related to this act. So they took 500,000 of that, and that's what you see in subsection B here. And they appropriated that for FY27, so you could go ahead and start staffing the school construction division more quickly, and then still maintain the request to have AOE come back with an FY28 budget that includes all staff that they need for the school construction division, plus kind of permanent support that they would need. So for right now, it would be limited service classified positions because it's just temporary until a permanent piece, but they would come back next year with budgetary requests. So in simple words, Section 66 is updated to provide an immediate FY27 appropriation for staffing the school construction division. The other money that you're going to see here is the new Section 66A. You'll know that we have an existing facilities master plan grant program, but there's not money for that. One of the specified purposes of the school construction aid special fund that comes online this July 1 is to provide funding for the facilities master plan grant program, which you'll recall is now an eligibility condition of accessing state aid, that you need to have gone through a facilities master planning process. But this is trying to tie in the facilities master planning to the study committee process. So it appropriates transfers $1 million from the general fund to the school construction aid special fund FY27 for the purpose of awarding grants through that program to SUs for the development of educational facilities master plans as part of the study committee process. So this is not funding just general master plan grants. This is specifically funding facilities master planning as part of the study committee process. If that's something they undertake, there would be $1 million there to help support those efforts.
Is that accounted for, that money?
Yes, so that is part of that. That fills out the 1.4 that was essentially available. And I say 1.4, I'll scroll back up. You see the 500K is appropriated here, and then you see the 1 million appropriated here. Senate Appropriations yesterday amended this 1 million downward to 900,000. That's because I think 25,000 is elsewhere accounted for and needed to be pulled in. So they reduced the amount that's transferred from the general fund, but all of the dollars that are in the bill should be accounted for in the budget. Section 67, this is your AOE rulemaking on school construction, and there's really two things that were done here. One is pushing back the date for completion of that rulemaking to March 1st, 2028, which is presumably logistically more feasible for AOE than the March 31st of next year turnaround. And then I would describe what they did with the rulemaking piece, which is to be rulemaking on prioritization and bonus incentives under the state aid program. They added a bit more specificity. So they built out 1 and 2 a little bit more, and then they added a new condition as well. So for 1, these are meant to be rules to address prioritization and bonus incentives that reward school districts for consolidating school governance structures, whether that be through the study committee process, so they tried to tie to earlier sections of the act, or by other voluntary means. They changed the language that's used to describe improving access to educational opportunities. On the House side, that was, relatively generic, which makes sense. They added a bit more specificity, and each time you see this call out to improving access to educational opportunities, the language you're going to see is improving access for public school students to excellent educational opportunities, including CTE, shared special education services for high needs students, and improved comprehensive curricular offerings. You're going to see that call out a couple of times, but just adding a bit more specificity as to what's meant by educational opportunities. But I would note that it's including language, right? It's not exhaustive of what might be covered there. The new piece that you really have is directing AOE to do rulemaking for prioritization funds such federal board school districts for remediating or eliminating health and safety issues that might have naturally been something that AOE would otherwise do anyway, but it is now a specific directive they would need to follow.
So it seems to have lost the piece in the House where we had the treatment of school districts outstanding capital.
Yes. Yes. And what I recall of the thinking behind this is that the view was that there was some inconsistency between having a request of AOE to come out with rulemaking on the treatment of outstanding capital indebtedness and at the same time provide a legacy debt aid provision that covered 100% of state aid. It was like, well, why are we asking AOE to figure this out if we're just providing aid to cover all of it? So Section 74, which is the legacy debt aid provision, is dealt with later, and it is changed. But that's my best description of the thinking that went into why it's stripped out is let's just take a single position. But of course, you could take both. You could say, we want to know what you guys think, and we're saying this is what we'd like to do.
And I might just add to the committee in general that, until such time as there is significant capital aid, this section of things is still available to be taken with. So as sort of, as the AOE builds its capacity, learns more about the situation, and addressing things like legacy debt in a more thoughtful way, this does not hold everything fast and firm for the next 10 years.
Yeah, which is frankly true of much of bill, right? Long-term vision. Section 68, this is your advisory board report on identification of regional high schools and rehabilitation opportunities. The approach that the Senate Finance Committee took on this is there was concern that the request from the House side was too much for the advisory board to handle. So in the House construct, it was identify opportunities of unknown number for construction or renovation, provide a full siting study for each of these, and then consider different state configurations across the opportunities that are identified. The change that you see, it's still targeting the same kind of idea, but Senate Finance said identify 3 to 5 feasible opportunities for the construction of or renovation of regional high schools to promote, and then it's the same call out that we just talked about, consolidation of school governance structures, improve access for, et cetera. And then there was concern that the full siting study could be technically burdensome for this group, and again, maybe a heavy lift. So instead of a full siting study, which could maybe be considered to be quite extensive and maybe further along in the process, just a preliminary siting study. So where's it at? What's the cost factors that are relevant? The hope was to reduce the burden on the advisory board. The other piece I would add is that the Senate Finance Committee's response, as I recall it, was that the House construct seemed to suggest a particular vision, which might seem like a mandate if you came out with specific configurations of opportunities that could be done together. Not necessarily my perspective, but I think that was some of the read. And so the idea of just identifying feasible opportunities and leaving it that and leaving it entirely up to the legislature what to do with it. I think there was some concern about getting out in front of the study committee process as they're trying to figure out what to do. So the hope was just to get something that even in appearance is more neutral as to what might be happening. That's the way that I would describe it, but you could, of course, ask those folks. Section 68A, this really backs up what the chair was just saying. It's a new section that is kind of already implicit in what passed the House, but clarifies the revenue behind the state aid program. As you guys know, there is no existing revenue to back the state aid program. And so this is just intent language that's clarifying that. It says, it's the intent of the General Assembly to clarify that the state shall not offer aid under the program until the General Assembly has received the Treasurer's recommendations on that total bonding support and annual debt service subsidies. That's the aid that would happen through the state aid program. It's what they would talk to CDAC about. So that's one condition. Another would be that the Agency of Education has operationalized that school construction division and completed rulemaking. And then lastly, that the General Assembly has committed to a stable funding source, which may be state bonding support to support the program. So it's just intent language saying school districts, don't hang your hat on the fact that some of these provisions are effective July 1. There still isn't money, and these things need to happen in any event. You need to staff the school construction division. You need rulemaking to build out how the prioritization of bonus incentives and other pieces work. And we need to know, the General Assembly needs to know what that recommendation on bonding support would be. Section 69 through 71, there's no difference in the positions. And just to call out what these were your policy statement for the state aid for school construction program. This was the piece that spoke to kind of the short-term vision of leveraging state bonding support to catalyze the program. Section 70 was your AOE responsibilities. It just added a technical piece related to providing, I think, including in its budget request, anything that would be supported by state bonding support. And then 71 is the State Aid for School Construction Advisory Board, and it was just clarifying language that they would need to provide. The school construction division would provide technical assistance. Section 72 is your core school construction section that sets out your application process and the aid that's awarded. There's a few different changes here. One is that you may recall the discussion around one of the eligibility conditions being that an applicant achieve the level of proficiency in DQS regarding facilities management. And there was an attempt to solve a sequencing problem for a new district that might not yet have met this, but would meet the level of proficiency. The changes that Senate Finance made are in a slightly different angle in discussing this ability for a newly merged district to meet the standard of proficiency. There's some discussion around the fact that it is a self-assessment, sort of like what is the real threshold of doing that? And so the request was just to change it, a flat rule, which would apply equally to a new district and an older district. The applicant demonstrate proficiency in DQS regarding facilities management adopted by rule by the agency. I don't know exactly what they would do to do this, but presumably they could look at the DQS standards and say, we've done this to meet this standard. We've done that to meet this standard. So it's a little bit of a higher bar. It wouldn't just ask for a self-assessment. They would basically need to claim in their application that they do meet the standards and try to demonstrate it. The other piece you're going to see here on page 6, the first piece highlighted, a new eligibility condition related to PCB testing. There's a bill I have not been involved with related to PCB testing on the Senate side. And maybe you guys have encountered this over here as well, but I know that there are some disruptions potentially to the rate of testing or where funding might go. This is to add in as an eligibility condition that if the applicant school district is applying for construction aid for a building that was constructed or renovated prior to 1980, that they have completed indoor air quality testing for PCBs in accord with DEC standards for testing. So if you have older facilities, which I think many do, you would need to have completed that for testing. And this is an eligibility condition, so it does have to be met. It's not just a piece for consideration. That also might be something that naturally happens through the master planning process that needs to account for environmental contaminants in the first place. So I don't know that it ends up imposing an independent qualification, but it could. The highlighted,
Ultimately, to do a major renovation, you have to do testing anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
I will say that there's lots of things like that throughout the bill where new language is adding something that is probably already an independent requirement. You're seeing highlighted language of existing language. So I'm just going to, this is going to show up a couple times. So I'll just explain what problem this is trying to solve. We had talked about on the House side, the sequencing problem that if you had as part of your state aid, state bonding support, you wouldn't know what to bond locally until you knew your aid package. This is something where I think I am probably to blame in terms of making this a larger problem than it is. I mean, I think it's a worthwhile thing to think about. I did not realize the way that the school district authorization worked for bonding is that you're just bonding, you're authorizing a capped amount, but that you go out to issue less. And so that's the solution that we talked about on the Senate Finance side, and there's some clarification added on that front. But this would maintain the existing requirement that you authorize those funds, but don't issue a bond until you know that you have your aid package, so you can maintain the sequencing. And that's the clarifying language that you see here for final approval that the district has voted funds or authorized the bond, provided that the district shall not issue the bond until the secretary notifies the district of its state bonding support. We have some other provisions later in the bill that relate to this sequencing issue and how the bond authorization relates to the supplemental district spending authorization. So we'll talk about that as well. But several of the pieces that Senate Finance tried to address relate to how to sequence the vote, that a school district would go out to authorize an amount for school construction without knowing what kind of support it would yet receive, trying to provide information to those voters so they know not to just vote down a project that they might receive aid for, and then sequencing the supplemental district spending vote to make it extremely clear to voters that they're taking on an ongoing obligation. On page 8, we do see an update to the amount of construction aid that is awarded. In the House construct, the base amount of an award is 50%, and you can have bonus incentives up to an additional 45 percentage points, which means you could have 50 to 95% aid under the House proposal. The Senate Finance proposal is to keep the bonus incentive bump up, so keep the same band, but to lower the base amount to 30%. So this would give 30 to 75% aid, and it's going to tie in later to a change that they made to the legacy debt aid provision. So I'll talk about that there. But just note that they changed from 50 to 95 to 30 to 75% aid. There's another piece here to note. You'll recall the discussions around providing annual state bonding support and how there's a lot of concern around ensuring that you don't you don't hurt the state's credit rating. And so the solution on the House side was to task the Treasurer's Office in consultation with CDEC with coming back with essentially a plan, like how could you leverage additional state bonding capacity and how would it affect your standard capital budget request. I think it's a little unclear from the House language how regularly that would need to happen. It could be that you just get it once and then that's put in statute, but as you can imagine, the actual number would vary based on CDEC recommendation, at least biennially. There's a bit of a practical problem here that at some point you'll need to solve, which is that if you're extending aid based on a cap, right, you kind of need to know long-term what it will be. But in any event, out of an abundance of caution, I think Senate Finance opted to say that annually you would receive this recommendation, which might be what you would expect anyway, or you might expect it biennially, but something to think about. Okay, so I just foreshadowed this one, the Section 74 updates to legacy debt aid. The first provision is in the bracketed blue language, not the statutory text. The legacy debt aid provision, which on the House side was 100% legacy debt aid for school construction as of the end of 2025, technically went effective this July 1. Obviously, again, no revenue support for that. So one of the first changes that you see is to make the legacy debt aid provisions contingently effective along with the rest of the foundation formula. And I think that some of the thinking there wasn't just solving the immediacy problem, but also kind of leveraging as an incentive to follow through with all of the transformation that's happening, that you would only get this aid if you make it to the foundation formula. There's a couple of other changes here. So in subsection A, Senate Finance made a change to the districts that are eligible. So on the House side, it was just all districts are eligible if they have school construction debt as of a particular date. The change that Senate Finance did is to try to encourage real meaningful participation in the study committee process. So they say that a school district is eligible to receive this aid only if the district is not identified as a bad faith participant in that facilitator report. So that is a directive that was added to the Section 15 report, which is that the facilitator would determine and identify any school district that is acting in bad faith, essentially. I will just note that this was something with a little bit of discussion. The concept began as the eligibility condition would be only school districts engaging in good faith would receive legacy debt aid. I think that's a harder task of the facilitator to make that determination. And if you think about it, what it does is it really creates a default state where no school district is eligible for legacy debt aid until they're determined to be good faith. So this is a slightly weaker, but I think more manageable version where the facilitator doesn't need to assess everyone to be a good faith participant. You're presumed to receive this aid. But if the facilitator notices throughout the process that you are literally a bad faith participant, they could call that out in the report and you would no longer receive the legacy debt aid. So it is not as strong of an effect as calling out good faith, but it is presumably a more manageable process. I will note that we don't further define the bill doesn't further define what a bad faith participant is. That's a discretionary call by the facilitator. The other pieces to note here, in subsection B, so an eligible school district's legacy debt aid shall equal 75% rather than 100% of the debt service cost. The thinking there was to align legacy debt aid with the aid that's provided under the state aid program. So you'll recall that they changed the top end, what's provided under the state aid program, to 75%. So this matches those percentages to say that legacy debt and new debt would be essentially could be treated the same. Of course, it's subject to bonus incentives through the program. The other piece is a slight tweak to the qualifier for the debt itself. On the House side, it was debt incurred by the district for costs related to facility construction and renovation as of the end of 2025. So it would need to be incurred and related to school construction. So they need to have actually taken on the bond. The change that you see in the Senate Finance construct is approved by the district related to school construction and for which construction has begun as of the end of 2025. So this would allow a district that had not taken on the bond, but had authorized the bond and begun construction by thinking that it's getting the aid, they would be kicked in to this. The last piece to subsection C is just multiplying the 61 million annual cap by 75%, which I think that works, but I don't know that the annual debt service payments are flat every year to say that if you have a maximum impact of 61 million, that it's as simple as multiplying by 75%, but that was literally just me multiplying 61 million by 75, 76, 77, 75 and 76 are the non-substantive changes to education payment, and there's alignment between the chambers. Section 77, or between the proposed by House and the Senate Finance. 77 is your supplemental district spending cap exemption for capital expenditures, no difference in the positions there. Section 77A is a new piece added by Senate Finance to try to get at that sequencing problem. So in existing law, Title 24 has provisions that relate to the ballot language that goes out for authorizing indebtedness. So this is that early vote, the first vote to go out and say, we want to take on school construction. There's a couple of cleanup changes that you'll see here. Excuse me. But the big piece, there's a couple of pieces to note. So the warning and ballot has to contain in bold-faced type some disclaimers essentially to the voters when they're thinking about authorizing this bond or the capped amount of the bond. Under existing law, it's that state funds may not be available at the time the project is otherwise eligible to receive aid, and that the district would be on the hook. They're responsible for all costs in anticipation of school construction aid. There's additional disclaimer language to say, again in bold, that funds to cover annual debt service costs on the bonds shall be raised through the supplemental district spending tax. So they know at the time of authorizing the bond, this is going to be covered through your SDS tax on a yearly basis. And then further, it says that any bonded indebtedness shall constitute an ongoing obligation not subject to annual authorization of SDS. So it's trying to, hit home to voters that when you do authorize this, yes, you're still going to get a supplemental district spending vote, but it's going to be a one-time authorization. The next piece is a little bit more complicated to describe, but accompanying the ballot text is informational hearing that tries to provide some helpful information to the voters. Under existing law, it's noting the percentage of costs that might not be eligible. And so just letting voters know you're not even going to receive state aid on these pieces. The new language that you see added under subdivision 2.
Before you go too fast over that, when you talk about not everything is eligible, you mean like the
Approved costs.
approved costs. So if the AOE will approve, they have a list of things that they'll approve as part of sharing of the cost. But if you're going above and beyond that, putting in a landing strip for a helicopter or whatever, that's not going to be covered by state funding. That'll be part of what you're talking about.
And that would show up in this informational hearing. The Senate Finance Committee thought it might be helpful to include with the information provided at this bond capital indebtedness authorization for school construction, some estimates of the kinds of SDS tax rates you might face in future years. They're truly estimates because they would depend on future. But the idea is to try to give a range of the yearly impact that you might feel. And so in that informational hearing, you would get the estimated SDS tax rate that would be required to pay the annual debt service cost. And it would be based on different aid scenarios. So if they receive no aid, what would that annual impact look like? If you receive the base amount, that 30%, what would the impact look like? And if you receive the maximum amount, the 75%, what would that look like? The board would have to notify the participants of the assumptions that are made when estimating these. So that's assuming that the SDS yield is what it is for the current year. It's assuming your student count is what it currently is. And it's assuming that you're not spending any more in supplemental district spending beyond what you're paying on the annual service costs. So lastly, the board would notify the participants that future tax rates would vary annually based on the yield, long-term membership, and any other spending that the district chooses to pursue. This is a lot of information, and I think that there was some discussion around whether this might confuse the voters. The one thing I would call out, and I think was discussed in the committee, was that this is not part of the ballot. This is part of the informational hearing, and it's trying to provide a range of estimates. And the other thing I might note here is that while we don't know, the estimates for your supplemental district spending tax rate may be more stable than the current estimates you could offer under our current education funding system, right? Because the variation that's going to be caused there is really related to who the lowest taxing capacity spending district is, which that may be relatively stable. And they're also going to relate to what your long-term membership is. So if your student count is relatively stable and the lowest taxing capacity district is relatively stable, these could be reasonable estimates. I would never have suggested estimates of rates under our current education. Like it doesn't, yeah. Section 78 is so we just talked about the ballot language for authorizing indebtedness that precedes the supplemental district spending vote, right? So that's what section 78 is speaking to, is the ballot language for that piece. And the Senate tried to clarify, I think, what the House was trying to do. The House provided two different ballots, one for your one-time authorization for ongoing school construction and debt service costs, and one for sort of normal supplemental district spending. I think the content is there on the House side, but the members were a bit confused as to what it meant. So hopefully this is clear. So the kick-in for your standard budget is if the board determines that the district should raise funds to cover expenditures other than annual debt service obligations on outstanding capital indebtedness, the board will present this budget. And it would say, shall the voters approve the school board to expend X amount for expenditures other than annual debt service obligations on that outstanding capital indebtedness? And they added some clarifying language about what would happen if you didn't authorize. So the piece that you see here, they maintained the same language about estimating the SDS tax rate, which would be inclusive of the total rate that you need, both whatever you're funding in debt service obligations and what you're doing outside of debt service obligations. But they note here that if the expenditures are not approved, they estimate an SDS tax rate of whatever it might be to pay for that annual debt service obligation. So you would know that when you're authorizing, even if you vote it down, that doesn't mean you're going to have a 0% tax rate. And then they modified the lead-in language to address some of the sequencing issues for the one-time authorization. If the board receives a determination of state aid, and prior to issuing any bonds, the board shall present to the voters for one-time authorization a budget to cover those annual debt service obligations, and would estimate what is the amount that has been determined to be necessary to cover those annual debt service obligations on school construction. And they would provide kind of a converse disclaimer at the end that if the district separately approves any supplemental district spending for the ensuing fiscal year, the total supplemental district spending tax rate provided on that ballot would reflect the rate required to cover all expenditures. So both annual debt service obligations and any non-debt service obligations. So much of what I talked about is just trying to make it clear to voters the relationship between bonded indebtedness and the SDS tax. Section 79 is a conforming change to repeal the ballot language from Act 73 because it's replaced with what we just talked about above. And then 80 through 83 are transition measures we previously discussed, no difference there. 84 is a delay in a tax rate, Department of Taxes report on the homestead exemption structure, no difference there. There is one change to Section 85, which is my last change to describe, which is the Education Fund Advisory Committee. You'll recall that on the House side, this was pretty dramatically narrowed in membership and in terms of directives. It's also pushed out to post-foundation formula, so it's not aiding with the transition. It's something that kicks into effect once the foundation formula arrives. The new piece that you see added as a directive is for the Ed Fund Advisory Committee to annually recommend the appropriations required to fully fund each school district's EOP under the foundation formula for the current and upcoming fiscal year. So presumably the way this would work is for the current year, you would know what appropriation the General Assembly has made, and you would have the weighted membership by which you could calculate the EOP. It's literally just multiplying that by the base amount as inflated. So you could compare that against the appropriation that the General Assembly made and say, they did it. And then for the upcoming fiscal year, based on the latest information, you could do that same multiplication and say, this is what we think the appropriation that's necessary would be. And that is really it. You know, there's changes to the effective dates, but it's nightmarish to walk through them. And I think that they've been noted as we went through. In particular, I do want to note the Section 74 legacy debt aid, which I know I said earlier, that's kicked out to contingently effective like the remainder of the foundation formula.
And again, I would describe this as probably an iterative process until such time as there actually is state aid. So much, you know, if this all makes it over the finish line, it's probably going to be examined and digested over the next year, maybe right for further consideration. Because I don't think that anybody put the $50 million in the budget this year for school construction aid. I don't know if your intention was to like finish right at 11, but you nailed it.
I would love to take credit, but I don't have that skill.
Any other questions for John while we have him here? That was really
Thank you
great.
very
Yeah,
much.
thanks for the side-by-side. Perfect.
I've actually put together side by side, so.
All right.
Thank
Thank you.
Credit.
Okay, why don't we take a 5-minute break, hard 5-minute break, and then we'll be back to straw poll the change